Welcome back. Now, should schools reopen while the country is battling the second wave of COVID-19? At least 53% of adults think schools should not open. And according to a finding by the University of Johannesburg and the Human Science Research Centre, independent schools opened yesterday while public schools will reopen later on this month. So to unpack those findings, I'm now joined by Professor Carin Runciman from the University of Johannesburg. Prof, thank you for your time and good morning to you. This is quite an interesting one, but I feel like we've been here before whereby, adults or even parents were quite concerned about, their children going back to school saying, hey, there's still a lot of numbers in terms of positive cases, but 53% or so are saying that they should not reopen at this time.
Yes, that's exactly right. And as you say, we actually have been here before. Last year in July, we faced a very similar set of circumstances with rising cases. And again, at that time, our survey findings also showed that the majority of adults opposed the reopening of schools at a time where cases are high. And again, this is what we're seeing at the moment, that most adults are opposing the idea that schools should reopen while we see cases so high. A smaller percentage, 19%, believe that schools should reopen just for grade 7 and grade 12. But the majority supporting that schools are remaining closed at this time.
Yeah, and I understand that the differences in terms of opinion on whether schools should reopen differ in terms of income, race, as well as, the type of accommodation. Let's start with income. What did you find in as far as income is concerned?
So we saw very differences of opinion by income. So those on lower incomes were much more likely to oppose the reopening of schools compared to those on higher incomes. And I think this is also reflective of the types of schools that learners may go to depending on their household income, and concerns from parents on lower incomes about the abilities of schools to put in safety measures, to have appropriate PPE, compared to learners that go to schools which have wealthier households. So I think it reflects those kinds of concerns, really.
Right. And also those attitudes in, whether or not schools should reopen differing from Indian, black, white, as well as coloured adults. What did you find there in terms of race?
What was very interesting is it does seem very polarised by race. So Indian respondents to the survey were most likely to oppose, with 77% of Indian respondents opposing the reopening of schools, compared to 37% of white adults opposing the reopening of schools. Again, what I think here is we see the interplay of the relations of race and class. But it is very interesting that it is so polarised, and I think that's something we need to unpack more.
Yeah, and also when we look at the type of accommodation, we cannot ignore what your findings there in terms of those opinions coming from, those living in township areas versus those living in suburban areas. What did you find there?
So what we found was that people living in backyards were the most likely to be opposed to the reopening of schools compared to those living in suburban areas. And I think when we consider things like the ability to do social distancing, obviously if you're living in a backyard, it's very difficult to do any form of meaningful social distancing compared to living in a suburban area. And I think what this reflects is that parents and adults are concerned about children going to school, and this perhaps becoming a site of transmission, not just within the school itself, but also learners bringing this into their own families and communities, and we see a greater spread of transmission of the disease.
Yeah, and I have to say that what I found particularly interesting was the inequalities in our society. Seeing the wealthier parents having more confidence in their schools to provide a safer environment for, their children. But when you look at the poorer parents, they don't have the same confidence in the schooling system to provide the same care for their children.
Absolutely, that's what comes through strongly. But even if the decision to keep schools closed is taken, there are other things that we need to consider. One of the other findings to come through the survey was concerns about data costs. Many people saying in their messages to the President in our survey that cell phone companies need to make free data available so that other forms of online learning become much more available to a much larger section of the population, and particularly for those on low incomes. This is obviously before we even get to the question of devices, but certainly data, if schools are to remain closed, will be a very, very important issue.
Oh, well, quite an interesting survey here. Thank you so much for talking to us, Professor Carin Runciman.